Wildfire in your forest future, what you can do about it. Thanks to Glenn Ahrens, Amanda Brenner, Carrie Berger from Forest Natural Resource Extension, and Mike Clausey from the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. The first of three great constants in our lives. As long as there is a sun in the sky, an atmosphere surrounding the earth, and carbon-based life forms on the planet, there will be fire. Fire in the past, fire in the future, we will have fire. And fire isn't evil. It isn't saintly. It's just a force of nature, a chemical formulation of combustion. The second of three great constants in our lives is change. And we're going through one of the greatest change agents in my lifetime with the coronavirus and COVID-19 disease right in front of us. Change that influences wildfire is temperature. Records of temperature have been taken across different countries of the world starting in 1880 consistently. And if you look at that 140-year record, temperature has been climbing steadily, and the last 6 years have been the hottest years within that 140-year record. Population. From the time temperature was recorded in 1880, there were 50 million people in the U.S., and now, the latest census, over 330 million people. That's a big increase. And they all need to live somewhere. And because of that, their homes are being built in greater densities in more remote areas like Gatlinburg, Tennessee, Paradise, Malibu, Santa Rosa, in greater congregations than ever before. We are also seeing a change in forest range, shrubland, agricultural dynamics, witnessing an accumulation of biomass and stressed out trees and insect and disease attacks and overcrowded conditions vegetation-wise than we've seen before. A lot of it is due to the excellent efforts of our firefighting agencies and entities. You know, they're 98% effective in putting out any fire starts, and over the last 100 years have done an excellent job of that. But due to this and management practices and managing by not managing, we have this huge accumulation of biomass, dead and live. Structures are boxes of fuel. And as I've said before, we're building boxes of fuel, homes or buildings in greater congregations and distributed over greater areas than ever before. That's quite a change. And homes are built differently. That's a change too. In the last 20 or 30 years, as this research project shows, they actually took a legacy room that was filled with furnishings like they used to have 20 or 30 years ago, wools, cottons, real wood furniture, and they took a room and furnished it with composites, laminates, synthetics, and they started a fire in the corner of each room. And when they let it burn, and there's a stage of fire behavior in a compartment called a flashover, that when heat builds up in a compartment to about 1,000 degrees roughly, that heat radiates throughout the compartment, and at that moment, when that temperature is reached, everything flammable in that compartment combusts. It's rather explosive, and it can consume everything within that compartment, ultimately contributing to burning the structure down. And what they found, and what we found when we responded to house fires 20 or 30 years ago, is that the legacy room, they're calling it, took roughly 30 minutes to achieve that flashover condition, which is totally unsafe to enter or even go near. 30 minutes allowed firefighters enough time to put on the gear, to get in the apparatus, leave the station, go to on the call, make a search and rescue, and put the fire out. Now, with modern furnishings, with all of these synthetics and laminates and glues, that flashover is now achieved in 3 minutes. And 10 times, it burns 10 times faster, 8 times hotter, and with more noxious fumes coming out of that fire than before. That's quite a difference, quite a change. The other change deals with temperature. And it's important to note that days that are over 80 degrees with sustained wind of greater than 20 miles per hour and air moisture or humidity less than 20% occur together more often starting earlier in the year, lasting later in the year than ever before. And these conditions, when put together, greater than 80 degrees, sustained winds greater than 20 miles per hour, and humidity or air moisture less than 20%, create red flag warnings. And you hear media is doing a really good job of broadcasting these warnings, thank goodness. But we're hearing those more often in places we haven't heard those before. Coast Range, you're hearing red flag warnings. In rainforest, you're hearing red flag warning days. So that's a change that's very significant. So what's the problem with wildfire and how we react to it? The problem is all of these changes create a web of change collectively, contributing to more intense, severe, longer lasting, more frequent occurring fires with more devastating effects on subdivisions, on those areas like Paradise or Malibu, Santa Rosa, Gatlinburg. We're seeing catastrophic results with these fires, where in the past we would lose several homes and consider it a very significant, well, it still is significant, but now we're losing thousands of homes during a wildfire. And all of these fires we've had over time add up, and they're occurring more frequently and having a greater effect on us for all of those reasons we just went over. And so far this year, in 2020, and this is the middle of May, there have been more than 100 wildfires already reported caused by open burning. Because now another change is that 20 or 30 years ago, the main cause of fire, the main cause of wildfire was lightning. 60 to 70% of all wildfires 20, 30, 40 years ago were caused by lightning. Now 60 to 70% are caused by humans. That is very significant because now humans can cause fires earlier, cause fires later, not just confined to the summer lightning season or when thunderstorms pass through. Fire season this year in 2020 started May 1st in Southwest Oregon. It was dry enough to do that. And with a water year measured from October to October, as of May 1st, there was an 8-inch water deficit in the year so far. I want to talk a little bit about risk and the assessment of risk. When you look at this chart and you see red, yellow, blue, and green, what it is, look at the left, the y-axis, the consequences, slight, minor, moderate, major, and extreme, and look at the x-axis, or the likelihood of that consequence causing harm. So when you look at risk this way, you start with a risk assessment to assess the hazards, the consequences of the hazards, and the likelihood of that consequence causing harm is a good way to look at wildland fire risk. When you look at risk, the whole thing is to identify your hazards, to keep the consequences as low as you can, and the likelihood of those consequences as remote as possible. You can't do away with risk. Fire is a hazard, will always be a hazard, but like any other hazard we use, it can be used positively or negatively. It can have a detrimental effect, it can have a beneficial effect. To illustrate that point, I want you to look at ladders. Ladders are a common tool. Everyone has a ladder of some kind. It's a very beneficial tool, a very useful tool, but it is a hazard. Just like any other power tool we have, a ladder is a hazard. Can be a hazard. The way you build it, the way we construct those ladders, how old the step ladder is, I don't know about anyone else, but there are ways to use a ladder, there are ways not to use a ladder, there are safe ways to use a ladder. And even when it's brand new and constructed well, if we don't follow the instructions of how to use a ladder safely, it can cause the likelihood of it causing significant damage as a consequence get higher and higher the more we exceed or not pay attention to the safety uses of that ladder. 160,000 people every year in this country are sent to the emergency room for not following safe practices on using a ladder, and those are ladders less than 10 feet high. 300 people die every year from not using a ladder safely. The risk goes up, and that risk is ours to take. We determine what the acceptable risk is. If your acceptable risk is putting a ladder on uneven ground, going to the topmost rung to do your job, the risk, the consequences, the probability of consequence gets heavy and high, but that's your calculated risk, that's your acceptable risk. So you need to reduce the consequences of a hazard by lessening the likelihood of harm by managing that hazard. Ladder is a hazard. Chainsaw is a hazard. Wildfire is a hazard. So what you need to do is assess it. And the difference with wildfire is a cyclic hazard. Fire is a cyclic hazard. Research shows, and it's common sense, that wildfire is a greater hazard during the fire season, when, especially during red flag days, and maybe not so much of a hazard in most of the country during the winter, especially when you have snow on the ground or it's raining heavily, the wildfire hazard is reduced, or the likelihood of wildfire causing harm is reduced. Conversely, fire in the structure in the house is increased during the winter time when we burn wood or we cook more or close off the house and we use it more. Fire in the structures increases during the winter and decreases most often in the summertime, except July 4th, of course. But so the hazard, the significance of the hazard or the potential consequence of that hazard reduces and is cyclic during the year. So what can you do about it? Well, you can do a lot about it. And let's talk about some examples for that. The main thing you can do about wildfire hazard is educate yourselves. There's a lot of materials. Forest and Natural Resources Extension at Oregon State is amassing, creating, publishing fire-related resources from the 90s to the present as we speak, adding as we go forward. There's a fire science core curriculum that teaches about basic fire science. There's a Citizen Fire Academy. There's a lot of materials published, good science, user-friendly publications that are within the library. If you go to the FNR Extension Fire Program website or the Extension Catalog library online, most of them are free, most of them are available, can be printed off, can be accessed, and a tremendous way to get basic fire education. The other thing you can do about it is to learn how fire behaves. And that you can, and there's a lot of educational materials for that. And the science of fire behavior goes back to the 70s. From Southern California, the Fire Control Laboratory down there in the 70s produced the basic fire behavior science that's still used today. But educate yourself on how fire behaves in the wildland, how fire behaves in your home. The more you learn about how fire behaves, and it's very predictable, the better you can deal with it, the more you can mitigate the results of that hazard and lessen your risk. Learn what a flashover means. Learn what how a wildland fire behaves, why a wildland fire is more intense, more severe, everything being equal on a southerly aspect versus northerly. Educate yourselves on how fire behaves to deal with the risk a lot better, to lessen that risk. So what can you do about it specifically in the home? What can you do about fire risk in the home? Well, the State Fire Marshal's office in Oregon is an excellent resource. They do tremendous work, and there are national organizations that have produced innumerable educational materials that are easily accessed. And there you can develop an escape plan, you can develop an evacuation plan, some measures to take to mitigate, to lessen fire risk include, of course, installing smoke alarms, changing your battery every year, sweeping your chimney every year. If you have one, develop and train to get an evacuation plan, escape route, if anything should happen, if you hear that alarm, and look at stashing your flammable liquids in a safe area, not overloading your electrical system in your house. If you live in an old house with older wiring, you know, the trend is to, with all of our electronic devices nowadays, we put in extension cords on extension cords on extension cords, and we overload these old wires. I don't know how many house fires I was on where stuff, flammable papers were stored in the attic, and bare wires, well, not bare, but older wires where mice chewed off the covering of the wires, then overloaded with electronic devices, wires heated up, sparked, ignited the papers, and burned the house down. There's a lot you can do to be safe, to lessen the consequences of harm, reduce the fire risk through managing fire-related candles or electricity in your house. Develop a fire safety plan for your pets, for your family. Get go bags if you need it. Look, listen, and learn. Be aware fire can happen anywhere at any time. And assess your hazards. That's a risk assessment. You start with assessing the hazard, and you look at ways to lessen the risk, mitigate the hazard, lessen the risk. Use fire extinguishers throughout your home. Most of the fires in a house, in a structure, occur in the cooking area, obviously because of the heat that's put off by the cooking, you know, grease or whatever way you cook. There are fire extinguishers that are specifically made for oils, animal oils, and fats in cooking appliances. When you use fire extinguishers, be careful that you use the right fire extinguisher that's chargeable. Don't recommend using fire extinguishers that are not chargeable, but make sure you have the right extinguisher for the right purpose, and that you have it easily mounted within easy reach where it's needed the most, whether it's the shop, the garage, the kitchen, right by the wood stove, and make sure your family members are trained in how to use it safely. So there are fire extinguishers made. They're readily labeled, easily labeled, color-coded, and make sure you get the right extinguisher for the right purpose, and you know how to use it properly, you know how to get it charged, and you look at it, record the date it was charged, and on and on. Have that escape route handy. Again, most fires, you know, in the middle of winter, 2 or 3 in the morning, kids upstairs, you don't have time to wake up and know exactly what you're doing. You need to train to get that muscle memory going so that when an emergency does happen, you know what to do, you know how to do it, and you just do it. Know where to meet in the yard, especially with younger kids. Have that retractable rope ladder or escape ladder if you have an upper floor, upper story. Know how to escape safely, train how to do that, train where to meet, and develop that escape route, and go to your safety zone and meet together as a family. Now, what can you do about lessening fire risk around the home? Now, you go outside of the home, take care of your inside, now go outside. Well, there's defensible space that you can take care of, and we have zones that we look at. FireWise is a tremendous resource. They're developed by the National Fire Protection Association. after the 2000 wildfire season, which was catastrophic for those times. And they developed an organization that is voluntary, but it's a way to get communities aware of defensible space, what to do within each of the subzones, like zone 1 right next to the house. You know, you need to make sure that you don't have flammable vegetation right up to your house. You don't have flammable organic mulch right next to your house. Your construction materials are fire resistant as best as possible. You know, you don't have wood shakes on your roof. You don't have wood piled up on your decks. Make sure, especially if you've identified a wildfire prone or greater wildfire hazard on your landscape, that you really clean up that zone next to your house. You look at doing fire breaks a little bit further out, you know, 30 feet, 75 feet, 150 feet or further. And if you're on a slope, widen those zones out, correlated to the steepness of the slope, and do your prunings, your thinnings, your reducing fuel, and there are educational materials to explain more detail what to get done surrounding your house. And there are lists that you can look at to clear vegetation, reduce fuel, look at screenings, size of screen for embers, which we'll talk about a little bit more. Trim your vegetation, plant fire-resistant trees and shrubs, rake things up, clean gutters, clean valleys of your house gables, clean an accumulation of fine fuels, and look at different practices at different, see how the slope changes, your width of zones change on what you need to do. And I want to mention that again, once again, that structures are boxes of fuel. And fuel comes in different sizes, and we're going to talk more about the specifics of fuel in just a bit. But fuel is live, fuel is dead, fuel is anything organic. No matter what shape, size, anything organic can burn under the right conditions and is fuel. Your structures, your homes are boxes of fuel. They're flammable depending on how they're constructed, how old they are, what's in them, what's around them, but they're boxes of fuel that will burn. You can have the landscaping, you can have beautiful landscaping. We have resources where you can look at for the climate zone you're in to plant. You can plant flowering plants, plants that turn color in the fall. You can run the gamut of fire-resistant plants if you're living in a fire-prone environment. Talk about embers. This is a video this video was another research project, and it's really important to look at what they did. They constructed a home in a large warehouse, and the home was constructed on different sizes of different construction material. Wood shake, asphalt shake, and they put pine bark mulch, and they loaded all this mulch into bins that burned with fans of about 20 miles per hour and blew embers, just embers, no live fire, but just embers, and they put plants and organic material and all the stuff that homeowners do around their home. And they had 5 Ember generators, and these embers were pushed through these big fans and blew towards. Now remember, the Kincaid fire last year in California had winds of over 90 miles an hour. And these winds simulated 10 to 20 mile per hour. But you can imagine embers going forward from a 90 mile per hour wind driven fire, what they could do. And these embers, no matter what the source, are now igniting the different construction materials at different rates. And you should notice the metal aluminum gutters stay intact. The plastic gutters melt, easily melt. And especially if they have debris stuffed in the gutters that weren't cleaned. And that's another annual maintenance you should be doing, is cleaning your gutters out of small debris. And they found out that fire-resistant siding, not the wood shake siding they had, but the fire-resistant siding remained intact. And what was burning in the roofs were the debris accumulation in the valleys. And ultimately, and you can see the screens, embers can get into the screens if they're not the right size mesh. And the other thing I want to show you real quick, let's see, let's get to the next one, are that the embers will lodge up in the rafters and the exposed rafters if they don't have soffits and fascia. So this is really telling on the effects of just an ember-driven effect on your building materials. Let me see, let me get out of here. So here's another view of that. You can see the fiberglass window screen. Embers can blow through that. As the screen melts, being fiberglass and not metal, embers can go through. They can get into the interior of the building through openings, so that another recommendation is, if you do evacuate a house, you close things up. You create fire breaks by closing things, doors, windows. And look at the fine fuels, the accumulation of fine fuels in gutters. Embers will just ignite that. Once it's dry enough to burn, 1 hour fuels will just ignite that. And look at the soffits and the fascia for your rafter protection, because most embers will lodge right underneath your rafters and start burning it. If you put fascia and soffits of fire-resistant material, that's a route that embers cannot take, and it can protect your home. So what can you do about fire risk across? And this is a kind of a documentation that's available using this link of the step-by-step process we used to plan and implement these landscape projects. Not to say it's verbatim everywhere, but it's just how we succeeded in implementing work done on the ground. And obtaining the grant money and assessing. It started with an assessment of fire hazard and an ultimate assessment of risk for those landscapes and prioritization and obtaining the grant money to do. There are innumerable management methods of management to reduce risk, to deal with the hazard, with the wildland fire hazard. There are contractors that are available. There's Oregon Department of Forestry, NRCS, all these agencies, entities, contractors are skilled, they have equipment, they have capability to do the work you need to do. And I know it's, for one landowner, it's daunting and it's overwhelming, but the recommendation, and that's what Firewise is all about, is to work together, develop an economy of scale, and look at how you can reduce the certainty of a catastrophic event down to being remote and slight by assessing the hazards, doing the risk assessment, and finding out what you need to do to change that red to a green if you can. Wildfire is a hazard with consequences that vary depending on weather, topography, and fuels, what drives fire behavior. We do not have control over the weather and or the topography. We do have control over how fires start and reducing fuels. We can do that. We can reduce the likelihood of calamity, of catastrophe, and the consequences of that calamity by reducing fuels. We do that, we reduce relative fire risk. Let's talk about those fuels. 1 hour fuels, fuels are categorized in 4 ways. 1 hour fuels are the small guys, up to 1/4 inch in diameter. 10-hour fuels, 1/4 inch to 1 inch in diameter. 100-hour fuels, 1 inch to 3 inches in diameter, and 1,000-hour fuels are the big ones. 1 hour fuels are your grasses, your needles, your leaves, your mulch, your litter, what lodges in gutters and valleys of your house, what falls in the fall and accumulates cones and that type of thing. Now, if you look at the flammability of fuel, think of your campfire, think of your wood stove, think of how dry the wood you want to burn needs to be. Otherwise, it'll just smoke and won't really give off a good flame. And think about the species of wood you're burning. Ideally, to burn a hot fire in your campfire or wood stove or fireplace, your wood needs to be less than 10% moisture content. A typical home, unless you have dehumidifiers, ranges anywhere from 20 to 30% humidity in the home. And that, I know that varies, but that's why a lot of times you stack wood in the house, and depending on the species, of course, and depending on your humidity, it's really difficult to get a good fire going unless you have a good draft and you look at tinder or dry paper. And that's why it's really difficult to get, especially camping, it's really difficult to get a campfire going because the wood is simply too wet. 10% moisture is not a lot of moisture. And when you look at the size of moisture, if you took an 8-inch diameter bundle of 1/4 inch dowels representing the 1 hour fuels, and you compared it to an 8-inch diameter bundle of 10-hour fuels compared to 100-hour fuels compared to a 1,000-hour 8-inch bundle. This bundle, having the greater surface area cumulatively, has the potential to burn hotter, quicker, hotter, and faster than the other bundles. And it would be very difficult to burn this bundle of one log all by itself. It's just, you don't have the adjacent fuel, the contiguous fuel, and you don't have the surface area for it to burn hot. And that's why we use kindling to start a fire, and then the larger materials to sustain a fire. And I want to talk about density management. I'm going to make a transition into the forest related to fire risk. When I talk about density management in your forest, I know this chart looks really complicated, and it's not really. And this is for dry site, east side ponderosa pine, and it's going to change for more wet west side forests. But for dry site, the chart still, the concepts of the chart is based on sound science, and it applies. If you look again at the y-axis up and down, you see it's in diameter. It goes from 0 to 25 inch. These are for the diameter at breast height of the trees you're dealing with. The x-axis going in this direction are the trees per acre. It goes from, in this case, 50 to over a couple of thousand trees per acre. Density increases as you go this way of trees, numbers of trees. Diameter increases as you go up this way. If you take the intersection of the diameter of trees to the trees per acre, what you have is a density diagram that says, according to the science, the research conducted to back this up, is if you have X diameter of trees in your forest, and you have X number of trees per acre, if you manage in this area right here, you are undermining the productive capability of that site and underutilizing the growth of the trees that you have. If you manage outside this band, you're managing too many trees for the size, for the average diameter, and you're into what is affectionately called the zone of mortality, where if you manage in this area, you overutilize a site, you exceed the carrying capacity or the productive capability of your site, and the trees become stressed. It's like a single classroom or one room in your house where one person is kind of comfortable, but if you put 1,000 people in that room or 10,000 people in that room, you're going to get stressed out. And being stressed, trees will start dying. Insects and disease will take over, and you will have a lot of dead fuel on your hands. The trick is, and again, this changes according to the site you're dealing with, and it's all documented. The ideal is to manage within this area. For the diameter you have, for the numbers of trees you have, this is your thinning schedule for a healthy, vigorous stand of trees. And reduction of fuel, lessening your fire risk. And it works. Look at it. Look at the tree ring growth. You can barely see it. It's so dense. Dog hair, dead fuel. This is a fire trap and an unhealthy condition for forest. Conversely, on the other side, you have a free-growing tree, a vigorous, healthy tree, open tree, less fuel, less of a fire hazard, less fire risk. And you can have wildlife habitat. You can have dead snags in this mix. You could have piles for wildlife scattered around. You can manage for wildlife, you can manage for water quality, you can manage for water quantity, you can manage for healthy trees by doing the management within that stand and lessen your fire risk. To minimize risk, when you're doing that, whether it's on your property, around your house, in whatever zone you're dealing with, or in the forested environment, we, like for your yard, in the fuel reduction zone around your house, in your property, or in the forest, no matter what age of tree you're dealing with, we recommend pruning up to get rid of ladder fuels that occur below the crown. And when trees are tall enough, we recommend going to 10 or 12 feet or how high you can reach your pruning saw. But if the tree is shorter, younger or shorter, it's advised to keep at least 30 to 40% crown intact for adequate respiration, transpiration, photosynthesis, to keep the tree sap going and strong and healthy. And an adequate, good-looking crown is very important to the health of that tree. A good-looking crown, no matter what the age. This is an old way to look at the health of trees. These are all different age classes, going from younger to intermediate age to older age. And the worse it looks from the outside, having a vigorous crown to a skimpy crown, these are all the same age. These are suppressed and have skimpy crowns, the more unhealthy the tree is. So this is your ultimate target right here. And notice the lack of ladder fuels. And you could do it, there are many, many, many ways of managing even age, uneven age, 2 age, 3 age. It depends on your objectives. It depends on what you have. It depends on your timing of entry of harvest or pre-harvest or pre-commercial harvest. It depends on what you want to achieve. You can still meet your objectives by shaping the stand of forest in many, many ways. Keep in mind your conditions. Keep in mind all of the changes we talked about at the beginning of this presentation, and modify your management according to the hazards you confront or are going to confront. And manage for health. Manage for reducing risk, manage for health, wildlife health, forest health, watershed health. You can do it all. You really can do it all. Because the consequence can be very severe if you don't. In the house, around the landscape, there are many, many things you have control over, you can do, whether on your own or collectively with your neighbors, communities, partners, public, private. There's a lot that can be done, and a lot that is being done across the state. And honestly, if the forest stand looks good, it's probably in good health. You know, if the trees look healthy and vigorous, good crowns, green crowns, enough space between to grow healthy, you can develop short and long-term plans, get your land management plan going, get your property plan going, get your health and safety plan going. Management is the key, and there's a lot you can do. Manage for water, quality, quantity, manage for space, manage for wildlife habitat, A forest, range, agriculture resource, natural resources are wonderful things to have, and can be managed to meet innumerable objectives simultaneously, not necessarily excluding one from the other. And look at the beneficial uses of fire. Again, like that stepladder, fire is a hazard, but under certain conditions, under certain leadership, under certain burn boss or certified burn manager, or when conditions are right, fire can be a very beneficial, positive tool to use. And we have many, many illustrations of this, from burning debris, from burning slash, to broadcast burning out under the right conditions, in the right places. Fire can be an extremely beneficial tool for these ecosystems, because for most ecosystems over the eons, since we've had fire forever, that's how most of the vegetation has adapted physically and genetically to cope with fire as a process. So thank you for listening. Please contact me or contact the tree school organizers for any follow-up questions or any resources available. And thank you for listening.